You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have our first guest on today. I want to welcome to the Final Say Radio program Ilan Berman, who's the joining us to discuss some interesting stories on Russia. Ilan, first of all, it's a pleasure. John and I like to spend an awful lot of attention on the Middle East and Asia, which we will include Russia in there. And we try to look at things from their view as well. And it's interesting. We look at different sources such as Pravda, or the People's Nation, I think is what it's called, the Chinese paper, and things of that nature, just to get an idea of how they're looking at things that are going on here or abroad, and comparison to what we hear on United States media and things of that nature. So we're glad that you could join us to try to discuss some of these important issues that are going on around the world.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
It's very interesting. John Kerry has been all over the world, for that matter, in recent weeks since he's taken over as Secretary of State. And it's very trying times indeed with all that's going on in North Korea, all that's going on with some of the cybersecurity issues with China. Of course, you can look at Syria, and you can look at so many other hotspots such as Iran, Egypt, and so on and so forth. But we're trying to break down some of the thought process here of the relations between the United States and Russia. If you look at the period from when the Soviet Union fell apart and till now, where we've experienced the reset, I would call it. Now we're going through the reset of the reset, maybe.
Right, exactly.
And there are a lot of conflicting things here. And so I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is, how would you sum up the relationship right now of not just the U.S. and Russia, but between Putin and Barack Obama?
Sure. Well, the relationship between the U.S. and Russia generally has seen better days, and it's seen better days, I think it should be noted, despite the fact that we've really bent over backwards to try to make a qualitatively new relationship work. The reset, which was, I think, rather ironically unveiled by President Obama on April Fool's Day of 2009, really envisions this sort of a qualitative betterment of relations on a whole bunch of different fronts, on arms control, on security issues, on missile defense, on what have you. But the hallmark of this policy, and the reason why it's been such a spectacular failure, is because it's an American concept. It's an American aspiration that we want to sort of reboot our relationship with Russia. If you listen to the Russian government talk, there's really no corresponding will to have a reset on their part. In fact, President Putin in December gave a speech to reporters in which in assessing the reset, and he made the point that the reset is an American construct. We really had no need for this at all, and I think that goes a long way towards explaining why the reset hasn't gone really well. It takes two to tango. We're really interested in better relations with Russia. The Russians, not so much.
Yeah, Ilan, I tend to agree with you, but I also feel like there's a bit of a problem here, right? I think at the end of the Soviet era, we had a golden opportunity that I personally believe was a huge miss on our behalf. We jumped into this sort of silly charade called the peace dividend, while there were people sounding the alarm that, there's never such thing as a peace dividend, there's always another enemy on the horizon. And it seemed like there's so many similarities between the Russian people and the American people in general, how we live our lives, respect for education, and just, appreciation for arts and culture and things like that. It feels to me like it was such an amazing lost opportunity for us to look for common bonds, and one of the common bonds was this thing that both of us were facing, a rise of radical Islam affecting our nations and our nation's heartland. And especially after 9/11, it felt to me like we really should have supported each other. And unfortunately, particularly in the mid 90s, in the Balkans, it felt like that was a turning point where we went back to declaring to them that we are enemies. So while I think we may have reached out and they didn't reciprocate, it feels like we're somewhat complicit too in not understanding their perspective on terrorism.
I think that's absolutely right. If you look at sort of the issues that animate the reset, this idea, shared desire to draw down nukes, or the perception there's a shared desire to draw down nukes, arms control, diplomatic discussions, all of this matters to Moscow, but it's not a core vital interest to Moscow. If you look at what Russia's been grappling with over the last 2 decades, radical Islam and the threat posed by these sort of violent extremist elements that have emerged not only on Russia's periphery, but increasingly you can now see them in Russia's heartland themselves, that's a core interest. And the Russian government, the dirty little secret that they haven't really shared so much with the world, and we're beginning to sort of see echoes of this in the Boston bombing, unfortunately, is the fact that Russia has its own war on terror, and it's not winning. Russia's war on terror has been dragging on for a lot longer than ours. It's been dragging on since the early 1990s, manifested in places like Chechnya and Dagestan. But the Russian government has really approached this in a very monochrome fashion. It's all about inserting enough military power to pacify places like Chechnya. It doesn't really address sort of the core issues that are at stake here. You have a self-determination movement in the North Caucasus, which is still very vibrant. You have a Muslim underclass in Russia, which is growing. It's growing in terms of numbers because Muslim demographics in Russia are positive, and the rest of the country, the population is declining. But it's also, there's a massive disparity in terms of economic prosperity. Sort of all these things have generated a tremendous amount of disaffection with the Russian state. It's something that the Kremlin isn't addressing. We can help them do that, but it's something that we've chosen not to engage them on at all.
Well, I used the term last week that it feels to me like we're going back to a level of proxy wars. Not quite as hot as the proxy wars that we fought for the entirety of the Cold War, but a very similar mindset. And if you look at the playing fields, some of which are very similar playing fields, they are things such as Syria, right? So if you look at Syria, there's oil pipeline issues and commerce issues there. There's also terrorist issues, right? Russia has an interest in not having the radicals take over because the current administration serves their interests. Neither the current administration nor the radicals serve our interests. And so we instead of finding a common ground or a way of helping to create a more civilized world, and both of us as clear, strong leaders playing against each other, it feels to me like the only ones who are winning are the radicals.
No, I think that's right. And actually, sort of just to put, not to put too fine a point on it, but, if you look at the reset, you could make a pretty credible case that the reset, at least tactically, is a success, right? The Russians are helping us in Afghanistan. The Russians have become our gateway to manned spaceflight, sort of all these tactical things. But in a larger sort of strategic sense, we're still worlds apart from the Russians on issues that matter, on radical Islam, counterterrorism, democracy and prosperity. And not only that, but that gulf, the gulf between the United States and Russia, is actually about to get a lot bigger because by the end of next year, we're going to be out of Afghanistan. We are sort of reorienting our policies more and more to look inward. And as the areas of commonality decrease, the areas of disagreement are going to increase. So the Russian-U.S. relationship isn't doing very well now, but it's going to do a whole lot worse in the years that come.
That's a great point. Ilan, I'm looking at something such as Syria, one particular issue, and clearly the Russians have a different thought on backing Bashar Assad than we do. We are backing the opposition. And I think that's a particular instance where perhaps we should be doing a better job of discussing the policy with Russia and looking at it from a perspective of what reasoning we have for going against the Bashir regime and why we would disagree with Russia. But instead, it seems that we're always at conflict with them on all of these issues. And I go a little bit earlier in history. Russia spent an awful lot of time feeling the pain we felt in Vietnam as they were in Afghanistan, and of course we followed them right up doing the same thing. And I feel, because you mentioned it, we're going to pull out of Afghanistan, and who knows, maybe Russia ends up being back in there because of their oil interest or other interests that draw them back in. So it should be something we should discuss.
No, absolutely, and I think if we were to look deeply, you'd find a lot of common ground even now. I mean, sort of the interesting thing that you see is that most U.S. governments, whether they're Republican or they're Democrat, tend to misread Russia. They assume a whole bunch of things about Russia, some of which are correct, some of which are not. But common to all of this is this idea that Russia is, first of all, politically consolidated internally, and Russia is also a rising power, right? So they can do all sorts of things internationally, and they're essentially a force that we have to contend with if we want success on the foreign policy front. Neither of those things are really true. If you look, there's a sort of fascinating recent poll done by a polling group in Moscow called the Levada Center, and it polled Russian attitudes about political candidacy. And it found that Vladimir Putin only had 32% approval from the very people that sort of reappointed him as president a year ago. I mean, those sort of numbers in a democracy are catastrophic. Even in an authoritarian regime, they're deeply troubling. The Russian government is far from consolidated. A lot of the things that they're doing is to sort of moving in the authoritarian direction precisely because they're so weak at home. But if you're a Russian and as you look abroad, you have to understand that you're facing an uphill battle. You're facing a rising China in your east. You're facing a Muslim insurgency in the North Caucasus. You're facing an economic downturn. Your economy really isn't competitive when it comes to global energy. And there's all sorts of things that the Russians have problems with. These are things that we can help them with if we have a true dialogue with them. If we get beyond sort of the platitudes and the idea that we just simply have to hit a button and everything will be fine. This is something that we frankly had the opportunity to do in the early 1990s. We had a reasonably moderate government in Moscow. In the Boris Yeltsin government, the country was a disaster, but we had the ability to talk to them about real prosperity and political debate, and we sort of frittered away that opportunity, and it really hasn't come back around since.
That's absolutely correct, and I would add maybe we should revisit our allies from World War II. I think if the Russians, the British, and French even, and the United States formed together and started cooperating more on international relations, I think we could be a good check against the rise of India and China and some of the other nations, because Russia's part of the BRICS, but I'm not so sure that that's really in their best interest.
Well, Russia's also part of the BRICS, but if you look at the sort of the internal economic numbers, Russia's by far the sort of the junior member in the BRICS. The economies of China and Brazil are doing much, much better. Right. And so, the Russians, I think if you're looking at Russia, the sort of the perception that the Kremlin would like you to have is, Russia is here, Russia matters, you have to take into account what it says. But if you look sort of at the dynamics that are emerging within Russia, they have a lot of problems. And so if you begin thinking about Russia not as an adversary that has to be pacified and mollified, but as a country that you can potentially cooperate with, but they need a lot of help, that's a very different policy. And quite frankly, I think it's a much more constructive policy.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a good summary of what some of my opening points are really all about. They matter clearly because they have military power besides just nukes, right? They clearly have the second greatest military prowess, and they also have a significant energy pull. In fact, I would argue that a great deal of their policy is all about sustaining one of the few things that are on their economy. You got to remember, unlike a little country like South Korea blows Russia away in every way, shape, and form as an economic powerhouse if you took energy out of Russia. And so Russia has been playing for many years now. They've been playing very aggressively on the geopolitical landscape because of pipelines and the ability to ship their energy around. Their economy is very closely connected to the price of oil, which means they have a very highly volatile economy. And when you think about this from a military prowess perspective, so if you look recently, we spent, it was $682 billion, or about 4.4% of GDP on military. Second by China, which of course is rapidly rising at $166 billion, or 2% of GDP. Third, at the same GDP level, 4.4% as us, is Russia with 90.7%. Well, Russia is very quickly not only being eclipsed by China, but in the not-too-distant future by, as you pointed out, Brazil and India and others.
Right.
And so, Russia is now looking to put a lot more spend in military, but if they do that, that's going to have to come at the cost of other sectors of their economy. And correct me if I'm wrong, you clearly spent a little more time studying them, but they suffer from a wealth distribution crisis themselves. The vast majority of their people are not doing very well, and those who are, the oligarchs and the people who maybe live in and around Moscow and St. Petersburg, that doesn't allow for a very cohesive, healthy fabric of a nation.
No, I think you actually said the operative word here, healthy, because the assumption is that Russia, which by the way has enjoyed for the last decade, has enjoyed a qualitative bump in sort of the amount of money that's available to Russians because the world price of oil has gone up, and Russia is an energy powerhouse. But it's, as you said, unevenly distributed, and it's also, there's no such thing as trickle-down economics in Russia. And so if you look at Russia, what you have is you have a small clique, a cadre of elites that are very, very wealthy, and the rest of the country, they're doing better, but there's a massive disparity. And the way you know this is because, if you look at Russia, the average life expectancy of a male Russian today is on a par with North Korea. It's about 60 years of age. The sort of the median life expectancy of women and men is slightly higher than that. It's about 70. It's sort of far, decades less than you would have in the West, and it's a symptom of the fact that even though the Russian state is wealthy and has been for the last decade, there hasn't been any meaningful investments in the fabric of a healthy society. This is a government that isn't doing very well by its people. And as a result, that goes a long way towards explaining why the Russian people, they may not necessarily like the United States, and they may not necessarily want a democracy in the way we understand it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they want the authoritarian regime that they have currently.
Well, isn't that why the whole Cyprus banking thing was fascinating recently? Because that showed us how all of these billionaire oligarchs who used crony capitalism, to a very impressive position at the end of the Soviet era, and instead of taking all this money and reinvesting it into their own country, a great amount of it was very selfishly stored away. They're buying goods and services of the fanciest type. Spending gobs of money on Bugattis and all these things that really aren't that important, instead of building a manufacturing infrastructure, a high-tech economy, et cetera, and then they're shoving it in foreign banks.
Right. No, it's sort of this fascinating little vignette from about 10 years ago when there was a moment, about a quarter of a year, where Russia surpassed Saudi Arabia as the world's leading oil producer. And it didn't last, because of a whole bunch of things. But first and foremost was the fact that the Russian government quickly became aware of the fact that, they needed to actually invest in infrastructure and things like that in order to have this role as a dominant energy power be sustainable. And they haven't done anything resembling that. In fact, all of Russia's energy infrastructure, it's formidable, but it's also all Soviet era. Pipelines are aging, fields are decaying. There's really, this is a Russian government that's concerned with its place and hold on power, not so concerned with the ultimate destiny and prosperity of the country.
Do you see any opportunities from, not for necessarily outreach between our countries, but maybe as a foundation for that outreach? Do you see an economic interest? Do you see any areas, any shining lights, if you will, that might allow Russia to join our Western-style economies in the foreseeable future, other than their oil wealth?
Well, oil is obviously first and foremost, but I tend to, when I look at Russia, I tend to be a little bit pessimistic, not because there aren't areas for cooperation, right? Counterterrorism is a really good example. Even things like missile defense, which there was an opportunity, there was a window of opportunity to collaborate constructively with them on it in the early 1990s under the first President Bush, and that was an opportunity that ultimately broke down. But it's because if you look at the long-term trend lines that you see in Russia, this is a country that's a dying project. The population is declining. Russia's losing, based on sort of the median of averages that you can see coming out of Russia, coming out of the UN, is losing about 1/3 people every year to death and emigration. By 2050, if you listen to the projections that the Kremlin itself makes, it's going to be a country that covers 9 time zones. It's going to have less people than Canada. And so, increasingly, what we're looking at as you move into the future, for the next couple of years, Russia can cause all sorts of headaches in the sort of the international security environment. And we do have to take into account sort of what Russia thinks and what Russia does. But the further you go into the future, the more you're looking at a situation where we have to deal with Russia and we have to worry about Russia, but not because Russia is so strong, but actually because Russia is really weak.
That's an interesting point. I can attest I've got many close friends who are from all the former Soviet countries, and I find them to be very engaging, intelligent, interesting people who are actually pretty well-cultured, and I've enjoyed getting to know them, but it leads me to think that there are a lot of good people who are leaving Russia and in those countries for some time, so it lends to what you're saying. There's almost like sort of like a brain drain coming from there to the United States.
Absolutely. Look, if you are between the ages of 18 and 35 and you have the means to leave Russia, you either already have or you're about to. There was a study that was done by The Economist last year, and they estimated that something like 40% of the entire sort of cohort, the entire age group in Russia that falls within those brackets is contemplating an exit from the country. I mean, that is catastrophic for your long-term prosperity as a country. I mean, they're literally sort of dying off and leaving.
Spot on. Well, Ilan Berman, who's the Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the Final Say Radio Show. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and we look forward to having you again.
Great. Thanks so much.
Take care.